Hey, welcome to Software Huddle. My name is Sean Faulkner, and with me is Alex Debris. Alex, how you doing?
Sean, I'm doing well. Good to see you.
Yeah, I guess you're my co-host, co-sponsor in this little endeavor that we're doing. We haven't really sort of figured out what our
Yeah.
official relationship is, but essentially we're here today with a little bit of a different sort of non-canonical episode that we're trying out. Typical format for one of our episodes is usually Alex or myself is kind of doing a deep dive interview style with someone in the tech industry on engineering topics, technology, different types of things that impact our industry that are interesting to us or interesting to the guests. And it's really sort of a deep dive with an expert. And today, what we're doing is a little bit different where we're, joining forces and we're kind of going to discuss some of the things that are going on and with recent episodes and dive into what's happening in tech and maybe a little bit about what we're doing in our own lives outside of recording podcasts.
Yeah, excited. I'm excited to talk about it. Excited. I've been loving the episode so far that you've been doing and just, excited to catch up on the news and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And if if you have ideas for the show or, you're listening and you want to reach out to us, you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at Sean Faulkner. There's also, we have at Software Huddle. So feel free to reach out there. You can, reach over email, and I'm, available on sort of all major social media platforms. And Alex, I believe that's the same for you.
Yep. Likewise. Yeah. You can find me Alex B. Debris on Twitter. My email is available. All that stuff. You can find me.
All right. So maybe to start, what have you been up to lately, Alex, outside of actually recording Huddle episodes?
Yeah, exactly. So, the big thing going on for me is tomorrow I'm actually leaving for Japan. I'm going to be doing a few conference talks there. So sort of just been prepping for that, both prepping the conference talk and prepping the travel as well. My wife's going with me. It'll be, our first time anywhere in that area of the world. So excited to check it out and, eat some good food, see some sights and talk to some people over there. So that's been dominating my life for the last week or two, trying to get that all figured out. Yeah. What about you?
Well, that's awesome. Before we get to me, what conferences are you speaking at?
Yeah, so I'm going to be speaking at Serverless Days Tokyo, is the main one I'm going over for. And then while I'm there, I'll speak at an AWS office. I'll do a NoSQL night. We'll talk about DynamoDB there. So Serverless Days Tokyo, just sort of talking about hey, what's going on in the serverless world? What trends are we seeing? Also just the talk I'm doing is called Serverless Now and Then. So what's it look like now? What did it look like in the original beginning? And what sort of some threads we see through that and how the space is evolving there. And then the NoSQL one, just some typical DynamoDB stuff, just introducing that to folks that maybe aren't familiar with Dynamo. I do a lot with Dynamo. And so, hey, if you're coming from a relational world or Mongo or Cassandra, just how does Dynamo compare and how can you use it?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
And then I actually, I've only been to Japan once. It was now over 10 years ago, but I loved it. I was also there for a conference and I loved it so much that I actually tried to move there afterwards.
Really?
To do my postdoc research, but I couldn't find anything that was relevant to the research that I was doing. So I never was able to pull the trigger on it, but I just absolutely fell in love with the country and the experience.
Yeah. So it's been 10 years, but any recommendations and stuff we absolutely have to do or try or anything like that?
So I had a little bit of a unique experience there because I stayed with a local family and I was also not in sort of a main tourist area. So I was in Fukuoka, which is in southern Japan. So there's a lot less foreigners there. And the most amazing thing that I did while I was there, and probably one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had in my life, was the father and the family took me golfing to a local golf course. And I had to dress up. They have valet service. And they had full Japanese bath in this bathhouse in this golf course. It was the laziest game of golf I've ever played, where I had a caddy assigned to me. There was conveyor belts that would take you up hills. So we golfed 36 holes, but I felt it really did nothing.
It's a piece of cake. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was snacks every couple of holes, amazing, fresh made Japanese food and stuff. So it's just ruined the golf experience in North America for me for the rest of my life.
Exactly. Yeah. I can't go back to sloughing it over here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm actually gearing up for travel as well. I'm leaving tomorrow night to go to Croatia, and then I'll for Infobip ship where I'm speaking, and then I'm taking off Tuesday night to go to London for Big Data London. So they are both conferences I'm talking about, essentially safeguarding sensitive data in the age of generative AI. So a lot of stuff on LLMs and how do you actually protect information that goes in and out of models.
Yep. What's that look like? You've just done so many conferences lately. Do you do the same talk for a lot of them? Do you tweak them a little bit? Do you have new talks for each one? What does that process look like for you?
I usually do something somewhat unique, but those sometimes be overlaps. Like the one that I'm giving in Croatia and London are basically the same talks. But then a lot of times I'll modify them depending on like what the conference is focused on or what I want to talk about and stuff like that. And then now I've kind of built up enough like sort of talk tracks around the space of like data privacy that I can go in a lot of different directions and kind of fit in wherever and adapt some of the stuff that I may have done in the past to kind of fit the format, or essentially, come up with something new. It's always fun to like try to do something new, so it doesn't just feel like I'm doing like the same, roadshow over and over again.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I felt. It's weird, even though like most of the people there probably haven't seen your other talks and be fine. It's like, it's boring for you kind of to like give the same talk all the time. I used to be in that mode of like doing lots of different talks, especially like during COVID. Everyone's just like meetups to like give us someone to come talk. So I would do a lot of them, and then it just got so easy to like put a talk together. I'm a little bit out of practice now. I'm just not doing them quite as much. So it's been like more of a struggle lately to put together talks, but I do like doing it.
Yeah, and I always try to have like a live component of it. I love giving live demos. I feel like, if I don't risk failing massively in front of everybody, it's like not worth it. And generally, like very few people will give live demos at conferences. So it's it kind of like sets me apart with that.
Yeah,
so.
That is cool. I'm impressed. Yeah, I'm always impressed by the live demo folks.
Yeah, I saw that you got accepted also to speaking at reInvent. How many times have you spoken at AWS reInvent now?
So this will be, I think 19 was my first one. So 19, 20, 21, 22, 20, so 5. Wow. 4 of those were in person, and then there was one that was canceled. It sort of just like rose up accidentally. Like I got in through the community track. I was doing hero stuff, and not that many people were talking about DynamoDB, even like AWS people, not that many people were. So that went well, and then they just like kept inviting me back to do it. So I don't know how long that'll last, but I love doing it. And it's a good time to meet people, and that's a fun one to do.
Well, maybe we'll actually get to meet live in person.
Exactly. I'll do a live show. Yeah.
All right. So we had a handful of episodes that have come out so far. I really enjoyed the episode you did on Planet Scale. What's the founder's name?
Sam Lambert. So, and he's not the founder; he's a CEO.
Okay.
But it was founded originally like by the creators of Vitesse, I believe, which is like the horizontally scalable MySQL solution. So I think they made that at, I want to say YouTube initially, and they started a company. He came on as like chief product and eventually became CEO, and he's been running that for a while. I'd say like for the last, I think 4 or 5 years, he's been running it and like through a lot of their growth phase and stuff like that. But yeah, just super interesting background. Started as a DBA at GitHub, like very early there, and just sort of rose up the ranks, VP of engineering there, then did some stuff at Facebook Meta for a while, and then joined Planet Scale, and just like a really interesting, cool, impressive guy to talk to.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of obviously like sort of technical depth to the conversation, and I liked the sort of the focus on building this like cloud native MySQL database that can be basically infinitely scalable. But I also really loved his perspective essentially on like building elite companies. And one of the quotes that he said in that really stuck with me was that like average people with too much time can just run amok around an organization and ruin it. And it's like it's brutal, but like the reality is like startups are kind of brutal. And if you want to build essentially exceptional companies, you need exceptional people. And it's just completely different ball game than necessarily being in like maybe a larger tech organization, or one that's like less ambitious essentially. One of the things that I talked about in my interview with Ben Popper from Stack Overflow, where we were talking about like this transition from big tech to startups, is that sort of time to prove yourself in a startup is really small too, where you basically have to be able to have impact from the beginning, because you might be one of 10 people, 25 people, even 100 people, and every single one of those people is expected to essentially have like company level impact, because there's just like such a precious like headcount or resource to the company. And if you're not essentially meeting the bar of the expectations, like it's
obvious, and you're like really hurting. Yeah, you're really hurting everyone else. And it's interesting even just seeing the change in the last couple of years, because you talk about the difference between like startup and big tech, but even startups from 5-6 years ago, where there was just so much more cash flowing around that I think a lot of stuff was tolerated, or it's just like, hey, we have a lot of runway. We can be fine with not having the sort of adoption and growth and progress that we should be seeing at this point with this team and these resources and things like that. So yeah, it's been interesting to like see that shift. I thought that was super useful from Ben, like, understanding that perspective between startups and big tech as well.
Yeah. And I think when companies are like flush with cash, they're maybe not as concerned about like the burn rate on people who are maybe not performing at the level that they need to be. And you saw in essentially the last year and a half of the downturn in the market, like companies cutting like, 30%, 15%, and really like not that much actually happening like impact wise to the company because, they're most likely cutting the people who are, meeting the performance bar.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's a different world. Good to see like in some ways to sort of navigate that from Ben and all that. And then I just love the Vercel one as well with Hassan. Like, I've been following the work he's been doing. And it's just like amazing. Like, there's some like goofy tweet threads or little demos and stuff like that about doing stuff with AI, but he's like building some like actual cool real products there and just like seeing how some of that stuff works. I thought was so fascinating there. So I love that episode.
Yeah. And I like that he's just like sort of like banging these out on the weekend. Like he just does like a weekend sprint, basically. He's just like, here's this thing I'm interested in and I'm just going to build it. And, maybe it is something other people are interested in. It's done from such a like authentic place and authentic, like essentially just like curiosity. And I think that's why it's been so impactful in terms of like they've gone viral or it's really raised his like profile. And of course it also benefits the work that he does at Vercel because he now has like this like following and platform to like really advertise what Vercel is doing.
Yep. Actually, and speaking of that, on that note, like talking about like what's happening in Gen AI, did you see the Vercel V0 thing that came out today?
I saw a tweet about it that I was going to look at, and I haven't actually taken a look at it.
Yeah. Okay. So we're recording this September 14th, but they just released this thing they call V0, and you can basically go to it and you can describe a React component that you want, and it'll just like build it out for you, show like a preview of what it looks like, give you all the code for it, just very easy. And it's like very, very well done. It uses this like React component library-ish type thing from this guy, Shad Cien. I don't know exactly know how to say it, but Shad Cien /UI, which like he makes all these components in Tailwind. And then he says like, rather than sort of like, I think a lot of component libraries, you're like, hey, install it into your framework. And then it's kind of a pain because it's like not your source code in different ways. He's like, hey, take this component and actually just copy paste it into your, into your source code. So now it's like your component and you own it. So it's like you have this nice template and thing that looks nice, but if you need to tweak it in certain ways, you can do it rather than having to like make some goofy CSS rule that's like super specific to a specific class to like override something and have to do an important or whatever like that. So using that, but then just like this V0 thing, it was amazing. Just some of the examples, like, a SaaS pricing page type thing or like a form or just like different things. And you could just describe it and it would make it for you. It's pretty impressive what they're doing.
How does it go from description to creating it? Are they using some sort of AI that's involved in that?
Yeah, I think it's like, they're using, probably open AI under the hood to do that, but you just describe it and do it. And you can sort of make edits to it if you want. I love the naming on it, V0, right? Because it's sort of just like, hey, like make something like get me started, and then you like it's not going to be perfect, but then you can sort of tweak it and it gets you down the road for it. And then just like the way you interact with it, like you can just copy paste the code there if you want, but you can also do. So you're familiar with like NPX in like the npm?
Yep.
Okay, NPX you can like run an executable, right? And so they basically have this command. It's like NPX V0 add, and then there's like a hash. So whatever thing you created, they're going to assign a hash to it. You can run that and you're just going to like drop it into your library for you. So just like super clean. It's pretty well done. It's like, I remember, 6 or 8 months ago, I was like, man, are we going to replace all programmers with computers? And then I was like, no, we're not going to. And now we're like between like Cursor and V0 and all of a sudden I'm like, man, the amount of stuff that one programmer can do now is just like pretty amazing how quickly.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's about scale, right? Like even like what you're talking about, this concept of like V0, it's like it's not necessarily the end product. You still need somebody who has like, deeper level understanding to go in there and like kind of massage it into something that's going to work. And Streamlits, I think recently released something similar where you can basically describe what you want from like a data application, and like the Streamlit code just gets like written, and then you're like off the races. So even then you don't even need to go to like your data engineering team to like build your data app, which is really easy in Streamlit. It's now like anybody can basically do it. But there's been, I think like web page creators that are either low code, no code, or descriptive for a long time, but they don't, they're not going to like solve the full problem. But I do think though that we're very much in sort of the toddler phase of like Gen AI. So who knows when these things grow up to being teenagers, maybe they will like go beyond sort of the prototype or like the sort of first cut to something that's even more evolved. But I think it's just going to shift a lot of the work that we start to do as engineers. Is like, there's going to be less of sort of the pushing, pulling data, like figuring out like, going and twiddling like CSS parameters. I do think that this will have an impact on certain types of engineering careers. Like I think like folks that graduate, like I think like 80% of people graduate from like boot camps are like front end engineers. And if your only experience really is like calling APIs, coding in React, maybe a little bit of like Tailwind or something like that, I think that could be something that, maybe it doesn't completely replace, but suddenly one of those people can do what 5 did previously.
Yep, exactly. I think that's probably right. Man, I had a point in there when you were saying that, I can't remember it, but I just think like what gets valued or like what skills are going to, see the returns now. Like if you have good product sense, I think there's like huge returns to that, to where you can visualize something, think about what it looks like. It's like, now the actual implementation is less of a impediment that it used to be. You can really get that cranked out quickly or have someone like that. So I just think like having product sense or just like being able to architect really well and understanding how pieces fit together pretty well, I think will be helpful. And then, the low level implementation can be done by these tools a lot of the times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think this is a good kicking off place to like the first sort of section I wanted to jump into, which is like this week in Gen AI, which we've already kind of touched on. But the other one that I was thinking of is like Dreamforce is going on right now, which is, advertising itself as like the AI event of the year. I'm not there, but a bunch of my colleagues are there this week and I've been paying attention to it. But the keynote at Dreamforce was a lot around AI, and they just launched Einstein 1, the AI platform that like aggregates data from a bunch of different Salesforce properties. They now have like Databricks plus Salesforce Data Cloud can access the same data with essentially no ETL. Back in June, Salesforce launched the Einstein Trust Layer, and essentially, AI is really all about data, and that's sort of the thing that they're emphasizing. Is like you don't have LLMs, you don't have Gen AI, all this sort of stuff without data, and Salesforce is like keyed into like providing ways to access that data and make it easy to build some of these experiences. And they even, come out with their own like Copilot experience that's built directly into the application. But one of the big things that they talked a lot about in the keynote, which is something that, I spend a lot of my time thinking about, is what my talks about are coming up, is around like trust and privacy with AI. And how do you essentially go beyond prototype or demo, especially in the enterprise, in a way that is essentially, privacy safe and is going to be compliant and all this sort of stuff. And that's like where we've seen, Samsung shut down access for a little while to like ChatGPT, and Italy shut down access and stuff like that. So I thought that was really interesting. Just there's so much focus, I think, on what you can do, but now there's also a lot of focus on like kind of slowing down and looking at the potential impacts of how you're actually handling the data and building these experiences.
Yep. And with the people that you're talking to, I assume you just see a vastly different scope and side of the market than I do. Like, are they using OpenAI tools, or are they too worried about sending stuff there? Are they hosting their own models? Like, what does their sort of AI strategy look like there, especially around privacy?
So there's a combination. So I think the ideal world is that people leverage existing open foundation models, but it's kind of similar to like the early days of the cloud, where people feared the data security of like public cloud. And then all these different companies thought like, hey, we don't need AWS. We don't need, Azure and the public cloud. We'll go build our own cloud because of that. And now like even the banks are moving to the public cloud because they finally realized, okay, well, like realistically, no one's going to be able to build AWS by AWS. It's going to be essentially like 3 or 4 companies that kind of own public cloud. And also all the incumbents have address whatever, potentially security concerns there are. And there's all kinds of different ways of sort of like running securely within cloud. And arguably, I'd say it's much more secure than trying to run your own cloud data center anyway. And then I think we're in a similar space right now with LLMs where it's so new, but there's a lot of companies are thinking like, I can't trust the open models. And additionally, Microsoft, Google, Snowflake is kind of putting forth the narrative, which is somewhat self-serving, that you should run private LLM and let's do it, in our infrastructure.
In our cloud, yep.
And, but the reality is like private LLM sounds good, but it's not actual privacy, because privacy really comes down to how can I, as a user, especially if I'm a customer and my data's in there, how can I control access to it? How do I make sure that, Alex doesn't have access to my customer records when we're talking to the same LLM, even though both of our records were used to train the LLM in some way? And private LLM doesn't solve that problem, especially if you're doing something like an internal tool. Let's say that you're Apple and you're using internal documents to train an LLM. Apple's a very secretive company. They don't want, a project owner on one project knowing about what's going on with another project, right? And how do you essentially govern access? That's like the real problem is, how do I know or essentially control, what, when, where, how information is accessed? And private LLM doesn't solve that problem.
Yeah. And then, so you're talking a lot about Salesforce and Dreamforce, and I'm just not that familiar with that world. Are most of those tools aimed towards salespeople and people using Salesforce for sort of, CRM type stuff? Or is it for lots of different, like what are those Einstein tools being used for?
So they're primarily being used so there's some stuff that's built into like the sort of like customer facing Salesforce products, but then also Salesforce has a very big marketplace where people build applications on top of Salesforce. Like people have built, $1 million companies based on building on top of Salesforce, because Salesforce has all this data. So then it's like, well, if they want to continue to be, leaders and innovators, then they need to be able to support easy to integrate like out of the box LLM experiences. Same thing with Snowflake. That's why Snowflake's driving so hard on, I think their like Gen AI tooling is they want anybody who's like going to be building these experiences that have data in Snowflake to be able to leverage that data in a really easy way so that they don't move it over to like, Databricks or something like that to do it.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. I'm just like not familiar with that world. It's been fun to like just see the different, like most of the or like the people I follow, the worlds I'm in are more like startup or like, I would say like serverless full stack type developer type things, like more Vercel world or like serverless AWS world, like smaller type companies and what are they doing with this stuff. But then there's just like a whole other category of privacy concerns that you're talking about when you're at these big companies that have so much existing data and things like that.
Yeah. I think the challenge though for the smaller companies is if they are a startup in the space, like, YC just had their demo day with like over 200 demos and probably like 99% of them were all Gen AI demos. Yeah. And, but like for them to basically sell into other companies and for those to come, go beyond essentially demo or, proof of concept, they'll need to have an answer to the privacy question. And it's going to be ridiculous for them to try to build their own foundation model or run private LLM. It's just too expensive, right? And then you run into like the whole updating problem too. Like if you're running a private instance, it's not going to be as up to date. Like that just becomes this huge maintenance nightmare, which is also the problem with essentially like an on-prem data center. And the value of using essentially public cloud or, public models is that stuff's taken off your hands. So you need some solution for doing that. So then like, how do you essentially like fine tune and craft the model into something that's going to like be able to serve whatever it is that your product is in a way that's essentially like safe. Like, there's companies that, I've talked to that are using like doctor's notes as training material to build a like model in digital health. And it's like, well, that's a lot of really sensitive information.
Yeah, it is.
How do you essentially do that in a way that's, privacy safe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting. And I wonder, like you mentioned the sort of knowledge prompts and things like that. I'm going to be so curious to see if we can get it better to where updating, like, ChatGPT now being 2 years out of date with sort of just like basic knowledge of what's happened and things like that, which in some cases is not a big deal at all. And in some cases, especially if you're talking about like writing code and what new libraries and tools and patterns are available, like, is a big deal to not have those. So I'm curious to see, like, it's interesting because like GitHub Copilot seems so much better about newer stuff than just sort of bare ChatGPT or something like that. So they must have figured out some way to deal with that. And I'll be curious to see what that looks like sort of going forward.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges from the updating, safeguarding, ethics. Like, there's a lot of stuff to figure out, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So at least, like, I mean, the good thing is, that means there's like job security for people working in the space.
Yeah.
All right. So let's jump into some non-Gen AI related news. So I know one of the things that you wanted to talk about was Bun.
Bun, yeah. Let's do Bun. So just there's always drama in the JavaScript ecosystem. Have you paid attention? Do you know what Bun is? Are you aware of Bun?
It looks to me, when I was kind of taking a look at it, that it's like Node without tech debt.
That's a great explanation for it. So I would say, like, in the last couple of years, there's been Dino and Bun, which are both like JavaScript-y, like, varying levels of compatibility with the sort of JavaScript language, with like the Node runtime and things like that. So Dino is a runtime that's created by Ryan Dahl, who's like the original creator of Node.js. He's like, man, I made all these mistakes in Node. Here's like sort of how I would do it differently with Dino. I think like TypeScript first and all that sort of stuff. And then Bun is a guy, Jared Sumner, I believe he was at Stripe, and then he's just like, I just want to make a much faster Node. So he's been sort of working on that for the last year or so, released it with this B1 post, and the post is just, it's like amazing to read. It's super long, and it's just like all these areas. It's like, hey, here's install time, comparing Bun versus NPM versus Yarn, and it's just like Bun is way faster. Here's bundle time, Bun is way faster. Here's like run, like all these things where Bun is way faster. And the thing I would say, like when you're reading it, it's just like overwhelming. You're like, wow, this is like quite amazing that so much stuff was done. I think like over the last couple of days, a few things have come out. Like, number one, some of those are like not quite accurate comparisons. Like, you're looking at like Bun install versus NPM install. Like, one thing Bun install will do is like basically keep a global cache on your machine and just like sort of like symlink to that if it's already available. So then it's doing a comparison to like a network request with NPM versus, just a local, cache, like on your local file system lookup, So like, that's not a fair comparison at all. Cause like, if you're on a new machine that doesn't have that, or you're on their CI machine, like it's not gonna have that. It's not gonna be that fast. The other thing is, like, it doesn't have full compatibility with stuff. And that's like one of the things that Node has to think about forever, just like maintaining compatibility for all these different types of applications that are running all over the place, and trying to not make that a headache. And if you drop some of that stuff, it makes it a lot easier. I don't know like how much Bun wants to be fully compatible forever, or if they're just like, hey, there's this area where like we're not going to support that, pull in a third-party library if you need that or something. I don't know exactly the specifics on that, but it's interesting to see. I like to see the, just the innovation and focus and attention in this ecosystem. I do like feel a little bad for like the Node.js maintainers this week. Like they're sort of pushing back a little bit, just 'cause like feels crappy to have that happen, especially like most of them are unpaid maintainers, like not getting, like they're doing this volunteer work, and they're focusing on a lot of different things, not just the pure performance. Whereas like if you're maniacally focused on performance, you have different constraints that makes it easier there. So
yeah, I mean, it seemed like a cool project, but it also felt to me like somewhat like a specialized project, like that where performance of like package installs and all this sort of, like, if you like, I don't know, you have a crazy big project or it's really complicated, like maybe it makes sense, but does it deliver essentially enough value for somebody to switch from Node? And I think that's the big challenge when any of these kind of like, frameworks or, languages take off, is like the switching costs for a company is like massive. So the value needs to be really, really high to warrant like moving essentially from one system to another.
Yep. And that's true. And that's the thing with like being like 98% compatible with Node. It's just not enough for most, because there's like, if it's something like, I remember when like Yarn came out to replace NPM, and it was just like, it works the exact same way. It's just like faster. Right. And that was great because, first of all, it's in a build step. It's not like in your actual application, so you can still run your tests to make sure it works. But also it was like very compatible with NPM. But like now if we're talking runtime and it's not totally compatible, it's just like, you got to find out in production that like all of a sudden this thing's not there. Like that's a hard thing. So to be, I'll be curious to see like how it goes, but like it's definitely very interesting to see. And the Node ecosystem just like continually has these things. I don't know if you remember like IO.js when Node forked like a long time ago, and they sort of came back together, and even like NPM and Yarn, they sort of came back together after a while. So yeah, it sort of like goes through these phases. I wonder if Bun will sort of get subsumed into it or somehow come back together. I don't know. Like, I don't want to see that ecosystem just sort of splinter to where you're either like a Bun user or a Node user. So yeah, I hope it turns out well.
I mean, is essentially the approach, maybe you don't know this, but is the approach with Bun such like essentially a foundational shift that Node wouldn't be able to adopt some of the ideas from it to, essentially meet whatever requirement Bun is meeting?
That's a good question. I know, like, just a few things I know is it's written in a different language. Like, it's written in Zig, which is like, C, sort of like a new style C. If Rust is like the new style C++, Zig is like the new C. So I don't, so there's that. It's also, I believe, like, it's not using V8, the V8 engine. It's using like JavaScript core or something like that, which I believe is like maybe in WebKit or something like that. I'm not exactly sure. So I don't know enough about those specifics. Like, is that something that can be pulled over or not? And, or is it just like, maybe there's some ideas we could pull over? That's a great question. I don't really know what that sort of future looks like. And it's interesting to see because Bun is like funded, I can't remember if like Sequoia or Andreessen or somebody gave him like $7 million. What's that sort of like, what does it look like to have a runtime? Are you going to provide hosting? Are you just hoping to get bought by somebody, or maybe everyone will come together and just be like, hey, this is Node now, and we'll pay you off or something. Yeah, I don't know what that future looks like.
Yeah, well, we'll have to we'll have to have our Bun or like monthly Bun check-in. See what's going on there.
Yep, exactly. There used to be a lot of talk about Dino a few years ago. I hear a lot less about it now, so maybe that's what's going to happen with Bun as well. Although Bun's much more compatible, so we'll see.
Cool. All right. So one of the things that stories I saw in the news that I really wanted to talk about was this story around whether RCS messaging will actually come to iPhones, which came out like a week or so ago from the time of this recording. And the reason I was so interested in this is because I used to work in RCS world when I worked for Google. So I kind of have a lot of like context and backstory.
Hey, can you tell me, I don't like pay attention to this world. What is RCS? Or maybe people
so RCS stands for Rich Communication Services. And it's essentially a communication protocol standard, just like SMS or MMS. So this isn't owned by like Google or anything. Like it's an actual telco standard, but it gives you similar functionality that you would see in something like iMessage or WhatsApp or any modern messaging system. So like typing indicators, group chat, reactions, images, video. But instead, it's not a proprietary protocol like iMessage is. It's an open standard. And the project owners is the like GSMA, which is like the Global System of Mobile Communications Association. It's been around for over 10 years. And it wasn't really something that had caught on. Because working with the telco industry, carriers, phones, it's a slow moving world.
Yeah.
And that's like one of the reasons probably Apple like went over the top essentially with iMessage. But Google eventually reached a place with Android where they had this super fragmented communication experience. So they had a bunch of bets to try to like fix that. And one of the number one reasons that people leave Android or stick with an iPhone is because of the iMessaging experience.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So Google had like they did a couple of different attempts at. They had a messaging app called Allo, I believe, and which was kind of like a WhatsApp competitor. It never grew like beyond like 10 million users or something like that. So they like killed it. But they also acquired a company called Jibe, which built RCS like backends for like carriers essentially. So they would go build this like RCS infrastructure, and then they would like deploy it for a carrier so they could enable the carrier on RCS. And so Google essentially bought that company, and then they adapted their existing SMS messaging product and created Google Messages that would support RCS. And that kind of like started this process. And that was like in 2016, 2017, somewhere around there. And essentially it was like in the early days with RCS, only small phone manufacturers were essentially agreed to use Google's like messaging products. Most of the phone manufacturers like, why would I use yours? Like I have my own crappy version that like sucks. And then also like most carriers were like sort of resistant to the idea because they didn't know like was Google gonna like screw them over, or like or they felt like they owned messaging. They didn't want to just be like a dumb pipe for Google, so they were kind of resistant to that. But there's other companies that would offer RCS, but of course Google was like the biggest. But eventually Google got more momentum, and then they were able to kind of they got Samsung. While I was still there, Samsung agreed to like all their new phones would essentially carry Google's messaging product, because eventually everyone was waking up to the fact that they're like losing out to WhatsApp and they're losing out to iPhones by having this like super fragmented experience that's like 20 years out of date. And then all the big carriers in the US, originally they said that like, oh, we're going to run our own RCS infrastructure. Then they realized after a year that they couldn't like do that. Like it would take, it was going to be a failed project basically. And then they let Google come in and essentially like deploy RCS architecture. So now there's like over like 1 billion people, or I'm guessing, but like probably close to 1 billion people that are running on RCS messaging for Android devices. So now there's like increasing pressure for iPhone to support this, because historically Apple was like, there's not enough people on it for us to like prioritize it, was always their default. Of course, there's like business reasons.
The self-interested reason.
Yeah, the self-interested reasons for not doing it. But now, essentially, what this article touches on is that essentially the EU, which is of course, very sensitive to
competition,
and like being fair, standards and stuff like that. They're putting a lot of pressure on Apple to essentially make a move to adopt RCS, and they already support like SMS and MMS. So it's not like they would probably just do like SMS, MMS, RCS, and iMessage, and then maybe they would like enhance iMessage to be somewhat different than RCS in some fashion. But
gotcha, interesting. And then so Google's work to sort of get people on board, they had to get both sort of like telcos and like the hardware folks to be on board for this, or sort of just one side or the other. Okay.
Essentially, there was a couple of things that they did. So they had to get the phone manufacturers on board, because Google manufactures the Pixel, but most Android devices are manufactured by other carriers, other like hardware manufacturers. And most phones in the world are Samsung phones. So they're like the biggest. And most of their messaging applications on those devices didn't support RCS. So they either needed to build RCS support into their own messaging application, or like use Google's or maybe somebody else's. But Google, one of the reasons Google got momentum was they just kept improving the application to the point where it would have been very hard, especially if you're a small manufacturer, to have essentially the software engineering chops to like build that application and do it at scale. And then once that started to happen, where there was enough sort of Google Messages users, that also created a potential for Google to kind of go like over the top, at least between Messages users. Like if there's only 10 million people on it, that's not that big a deal. But if you have 500 million people, then suddenly you can kind of like go around the carriers if you want. So that creates a lot of pressure for the carriers to do something. And essentially, like Google like offered like, hey, you can run your own RCS backend, you can use our RCS backend. Like there's a lot of sort of options there. And then of course there's also a lot of like financial opportunities going on there with there's a business product that's built on this, which is what I worked on, which is RCS business messaging, which is essentially like a business protocol similar to WhatsApp business messaging and Apple Business Chat, where you can actually create like have like a chatbot experience essentially inside a native messaging app.
Gotcha. Okay. And then so if this sort of went through and Apple's on it, do you think that would is that going to severely hurt WhatsApp and sort of like, and these like ancillary messaging? Like I feel like I have like 4 messaging apps. Each one is like for one person that I happen to connect with. Like what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Like I think in some ways it might be too late with like WhatsApp. Like there's I think over 2 billion people on WhatsApp at this point. And like what is this? The biggest advantage that Google would have, and I guess like iPhone as well, is that their apps are native. So you don't have to install anything. It's like right there. So even though you might use WhatsApp, if you're on an Android device, you still do a lot of SMS as well. And especially like a lot of business messaging goes over SMS, which is a super insecure channel, but it's still like used a lot all over the world. And it's like a multi-billion dollar, it's like $70 billion worldwide industry. So and that's continuing to grow. So if you can basically bring more money and value to that over like the RCS protocol, then that devalues WhatsApp, at least from like a business sense. So there's a bunch of things that could potentially happen, but I'm curious to see, like, WhatsApp also has like, it's probably going to be a situation where people just have like both applications, and maybe WhatsApp becomes one type of use, just like, you have LinkedIn that you might use for your sort of like work identity. And then you have other social media platforms that are more for like your friends and family, and messaging could end up in a similar state.
Yep. Interesting. Well, maybe Google will just have to like pay off Apple to start using, or like they do with the Google search engine, Safari, and pay them like $10 billion a year or whatever to make that the default. Maybe they'll have to do the same thing for this RCS to make it, to finally get Apple to make the switch there.
Yeah, or the EU is just going to like,
exactly.
Basically cut off Apple sales in Europe or something like that.
Yeah. It's pretty wild though. Like, I think Google pays like $10 billion a year for the Google search engine to be the default on Safari, and Apple's entire M&A budget for the year is like 12 to 15 million. And if you think of like what they're doing with chips and like Vision Pro and all that stuff, and realize it's like almost entirely funded by Google being the default search engine, it's like, it's just crazy how that works out.
Yeah. It's insane.
Yep.
All right.
Cool.
So
Well,
let's talk about Retool.
okay. Yeah, this is a good one. I want to hear your perspective on it because you work more like in the security privacy space. But like I read this yesterday and I was like, it just blew my mind. So Retool, which is it's a tool with like managed internal tooling software, is like what I think is like the core use case, right? Like imagine you have like customer support workflows, someone calls in or whatever, and they want to see like why they exceed a limit or something like that. You can build out like dashboards or tools for your customer support team to view into your application, to alter stuff, things like that. It has a bunch of other use cases, but that's what I sort of think of it for. But Retool, anyway, they announced they sort of were hacked, right? Like 27 of their customers were accessed in this unauthorized way. And I was just blown away by like the like complexity of the hack and how good the hackers were. So basically this is what happened. Retool had recently switched their sort of single sign-on, I believe, over to Okta. So they had like this new login portal. So there's sort of like, it's an area of a time of confusion anyway. A bunch of employees receive a text message from someone from IT, claiming to be from IT, saying, hey, there's an issue with your open enrollment, health insurance type stuff. This is probably like, renewal time and things like that. They say, hey, go to your portal and sign in. They go to a place that looks like the Okta portal, but is not the new Okta portal. One of the employees actually does it, which triggers like an MFA request, right? And then that employee gets a call from someone saying, hey, give me your MFA code, saying they're an IT employee. They had deep faked the IT employee's voice, which I can't even imagine how that happened. They said the person that called was familiar with the floor plan of the office, with coworkers that work there, with all kinds of internal processes at the company. And I just like can't imagine, like, this is Retool, which is like a big company, but it's also not like Google or Microsoft or Amazon or something like that, which is just like, if you could get in, some crazy stuff. So the amount of depth they went into, and then once they sort of got that that MFA and got in, that person had, they're using like a Google Authenticator app, and they chose to back up all their MFA codes into the cloud in Google, which now this person was able to access all those, basically giving them the keys of the kingdom, and just looked over, looked over data for 27 customers, which I think they said were all in the crypto industry and stuff like that. But I mean, two things that stuck out to me there is just, number one, the complexity of that attack. And it's just like, how do you even protect against something like that when it's that hard, other than just like extreme vigilance and training with your employees? It's just like, hey, if someone calls you, you got to say, no, I'll call you back, or, that. And then also this trend of sort of like MFA becoming single factor again, which, you're seeing with Google allowing you to back this up for convenience purposes, but now it's easy to get them all. Or like I use 1Password and they allow me to store, my one-time password configuration in 1Pass. So now my password's there, my MFA token's there. It's like, well, now it's not MFA. It's single FA. So I don't know your thoughts on this. Like, what do you see in this space? Is this surprising to you? What do you think?
I think what I was mostly surprised by was how sophisticated it seemed like targeted this attack was, because a lot of breach attacks are opportunistic, where it's like a known exploit, and they're kind of just like scattering out like who's like got an old piece of like software running, or like old piece of hardware, and like they go after them and get in. Whereas this was like, clearly like a lot of research went into this.
Ah.
And like, why retool? Like before company.
Exactly, right?
But I think like the other thing that I was really, and probably one of the reasons they were so open about like talking about it, was the actual impact of the breach was pretty minimal. Like the person got a hold of like 27 customers, like in the grand scheme of things, that's not that much data. They shut it down pretty quickly. And I think it actually spoke a lot to like their approach with like zero trust, as well as essentially like data isolation that they do through like on-prem installs and stuff, which is something that like the technology that is part of my day job at Skyflow is built on, essentially the principles of isolation and also zero trust. So like it's kind of like satisfying to see those things like work in action. Yeah. And like if you compare to like other types of breaches that happen, like Robinhood's like a famous one from 2 years ago, like again, a social engineering thing where customer support agent got tricked into giving up their credentials, but then that person had access to 6 million plain text records. So like that is way more embarrassing for the company than what happened at Retool. And the reality is, if someone's like determined enough to target a company, and they also are like, you know, sophisticated enough, they can basically get into any company. But what the company has control over a lot of time is like, what is the severity of that impact? And that's kind of like where the modern best practices around like zero trust, principles of isolation, all these types of things, like essentially never trust, always verify, really start to come into control. Because the historic approach is like, you're basically building like a perimeter, like a fence around your data, your infrastructure. But once someone's in that fence, everybody's like trusted at the same level. And that's where you get like the Robinhood problems. Like, why does a customer support agent need access to like every single customer record? They don't. And like, if you compare, there was also a attack on MGM, the hotel chain recently. And in the same, by this, I think they're called Scattered Spider is the name of the like hacking group. But same thing, social engineering. They used employees' profiles to like social media profiles to kind of like be able to have enough information to like trick people. But you think of like a company like MGM, like they're not even a technology company, like in the sense of like Retool, and probably like thousands of employees. Like you're gonna find somebody that you can trick into giving something, and they had to like shut down all these different like disconnected systems to like stop the attack. Like they had to shut down their their slot machine. Like they must have lost like every minute in Vegas is probably like millions of dollars. So like the like impact of that is like massive. And they probably like, even if they wanted to try to fix that at this point, like their sort of like technology infrastructure is so like convoluted and complicated, and the data is everywhere. Like they probably have like, it's just like an intractable problem for them. And this is something I see in my day job all the time.
I also just wonder like how prevalent these attacks are for much smaller ones that we never hear about. Like I was talking to a friend, this has probably been 6 months ago, and I never followed up, but he's like, our company like is basically being held ransom right now. And we're trying to figure out, like, they want this much Bitcoin or whatever. We're trying to figure out what to do and how to handle that sort of thing. I never followed up on like what happened there, but it definitely didn't make the news. Like I never saw it. So it's just like, I wonder how many little companies, especially like that aren't tech companies, that are just like tiny little people out there doing this and just get held ransom. And it's just like, man.
If the breach is below a certain, I can't remember the amounts, but like a certain, like the count of essentially compromised, records, then you don't have to like publicly report it. And then the other thing too is like like in engineering, a lot of times we get this like false sense of security from, hey, the data is encrypted, so like you can't do anything with it. But they're still essentially liable. Like this is what happened with was it LastPass, where the backups got stolen and it's encrypted, but essentially, like in theory, someone has all the time in the world to essentially like break the encryption. Right? And like that might not happen, but like you still
just
have to respond because you can't even do anything. It's not like you can rotate the encryption key. Like they physically have like like encrypted data, so they can do whatever they want with it. So it takes a lot more like sophistication beyond just like encryption. And essentially we end up with like this data everywhere, and it just becomes like a nightmare to try to like control access to it.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. What a mess of a world. Just like the security and trust stuff. I can't even imagine. Pretty wild.
Well, awesome. Well, on that doomsday note, I think this is a good place to start to wrap up. Again, as I said at the top of the show, if you have ideas for guests for Software Huddle, for either myself or for Alex, ideas for, these non-canonical episodes, we're all ears. So you can reach out to us, on Twitter at Software Huddle or, at our namesakes as well. Alex, you want to say anything before we wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for being with us, Sean. I hope the travel and the talks go well. And yeah, we'll see you again in a month or so.
Awesome. All right. Cheers.